Welcome to the Beyond Atheism podcast, with me, Nathan Alexander, and my co-host, Todd Tavares. This podcast moves beyond questions of God's existence to ask, what's next in a godless world? If you're enjoying the show so far, remember to like and subscribe, rate and review, and consider supporting us on Patreon. Beyond Atheism is produced and distributed by Atheists United Studios.
David Newheiser is a senior research fellow in the Institute for Religion and Critical Inquiry at Australian Catholic University. He's the author of Hope in the Secular Age, editor of the Varieties of Atheism, and is currently the co-editor of Secular Art and Spiritual Practice, as well as writing a book on miracles, religious and otherwise. It's a lot of work you've got going on, David. Welcome to Beyond Atheism.
Thanks, Todd. So happy to talk to you guys.
Yeah, thanks, David. Looking forward to talking with you. So before we get into talking more about the content of your work, I wanted to ask about your religious background. And I think that, I think many people we've talked to, have kind of a story of moving away from religion. But I think in your case, you've actually gone through a heresy trial. As I've ever learned or heard.
No way.
Is that right?
Do you get that one very often? Yeah, that is right. Yeah. I was just remembering, as I'm preparing to talk to you guys, I was sort of thinking about who I was at the age of 15 and sort of remembering that time. And I used to play this game with people where we'd sort of have a competition to see who had the most sort of conservative, wacky upbringing. And that was always my trump card, that when I was in my second year of college, my father was the pastor of a fundamentalist Baptist church in Southern California, and he initiated a proceeding that lasted, 6-8 months. It was a sort of extended process that culminated in a two-hour interview with the leadership of the church, sort of 6 or 7 white men, just grilling me. And at the end of it, they decided that I was a heretic and they expelled me from the community. Yeah.
Whoa. So you didn't just go to trial. You were basically convicted of heresy. And would they call that excommunication?
Yeah, they would. I mean, it's because it's this sort of, like American Christianity is so varied, but this form of it doesn't really have a sort of ecclesiastical bureaucracy. It's pretty informal, but yeah, they excommunicated me.
And what was the main heretical thing that you did or believed?
I mean, the funny thing about it is that I thought that I was being more consistent about believing the things they claimed to believe. So I've come a long way since then, but at the time, yes, it was a Calvinist, Reformed Baptist, fundamentalist church. And the sort of instigating event, the thing that really sparked it off, was that I was dating a young woman at my university who was Buddhist, and her parents were from Sri Lanka. And so the fact that I was dating anyone was already pretty troubling to my parents, because I don't know if you guys know about this weird sort of evangelical subculture around courtship. I had kissed dating goodbye. It was this big movement, Joshua Harris, that thought that young people shouldn't date each other. And that actually, when people are coupling up, basically the parents should be super involved. Maybe they should actually just choose who pairs up, but definitely people shouldn't do it by themselves. So I was dating someone, and then she wasn't a Christian. And so that raised a bunch of questions for them about what I believe, because for this community, anyone who's not Christian, or even more specifically, anyone who's not their kind of Christian, a very specific sort of Christian, is going to hell, doesn't have the Holy Spirit. And so they asked me about this, and the view that I held at the time was that for this tradition, salvation is only an act of God. So it's not something that people really contribute anything to. It's this theological concept of providence. So God chooses who's saved and who's not. And I thought, if God chooses who's going to be saved and who's not, I don't know who God has chosen. I don't know if God has chosen, this Sri Lankan woman who seems like a very good person. And so I rejected the view that these people could know with certainty who was in and who was out of heaven. And that was enough to indicate to them that I was no longer a Christian.
Right. Right. Challenging their power is really what did it.
That's right. Yeah, I think it had to do with a certain attachment to a certain kind of certainty. Yeah.
Mm. Do you remember what the line of questioning was?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it hinged upon how I could believe what I believed about this relationship that I was in, while also believing, as I did at the time, that the Bible is the infallible, inerrant Word of God. So it's a common view among evangelical Christians in the United States that every little word in the Bible is true and true in a literal sense. And they read the Bible and they thought that what it meant is that Buddhists are going to hell. And I didn't think that was there. I thought they were reading a lot of sort of cultural assumptions that didn't actually have much to do with the Bible at all. But that was the thing that really pissed them off.
Yeah. And so I've met people, made friends with people who've gone through something similar, either like come out as gay and been sort of kind of blackballed in the community, or come out as atheists and had real struggles with their family, or lost a lot of their social network, lost that political capital in the community. But this is intense. This is your church, presumably it's your university and your family all at once. How did that shake out? What was the where were you later? How did it affect you personally?
Yeah, it was profound. I mean, I at the time I wasn't sure whether they were right that I was going to hell. So that's probably the main thing. I found it really terrifying. I mean, I think just to sort of set the context, it's important to say that I was really raised in an enclave. So I was taught at home, I was homeschooled, and that was because my parents didn't want me to learn about what they called the theory of evolution. And so all of my educational choices were sort of filtered through this pretty narrow worldview. And what that meant is that I didn't have a whole lot of friends who weren't also a part of this subculture. So I had friends who, most of whom were also homeschooled, and all of whom were this kind of Christian. But at the moment when I was kicked out, being kicked out of the church also meant losing all of that. So I had friends from the community who would send me these really wrenching letters begging me to come back to the faith because they thought that I had really put my soul in jeopardy. In addition to all of that, it was just difficult to figure out how I was going to complete my education, because my parents had been supporting me. I was going to a private college. I was lucky to be there, but then after a year and a half, the financial support from my parents just quit completely, and so I had to figure out, like, how am I going to make my way in the world? I've got to figure out how to eat, how to finish my degree, and what happens after that. It was a lot.
Yeah. That, man. And at the time you were Christian, right? You still had belief. When did that go away, or has it?
Yeah, I think a lot of the process of recovery has been around my studies in the field of religious studies. So it was around the time of this break, just after it, that I began to study religion in an academic way. And I'd had a lot of training, of course, in this very specific form of Christianity, but I wanted to understand what this experience meant. And I also wanted to try to put together the pieces of myself, because it became pretty clear within a year or so of my excommunication that I couldn't be that kind of Christian anymore. But I also still felt that I had been marked by it in certain ways. And so the thing I was working on for a good long time was how to honor both of those things, how to live a life of integrity. And one of the things that was probably most healing was just realizing that the world of Christianity was a lot more complex than I had been raised to believe. So a lot of the things that I'd been told were sort of intrinsic to Christian belief, non-negotiables, I saw as a sort of pretty eccentric, modern, and even specifically American form of Christianity. And there, Christianity in Ethiopia in the 4th century, and in southern Spain in the 12th century, and in Korea in the 19th century. I mean, these are really different communities doing and believing really different things. So exploring that was really instrumental in sort of finding my way out of the tradition I was raised in. But the second thing, and this is one of the reasons that I've been interested in atheism for really personal reasons, was reading atheist authors when I was an undergraduate were really instrumental in trying to digest this experience. And yeah, that was quite formative early on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So how do you identify now, religiously or otherwise, or if you want to put a label on it? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, this is partly, I think, a legacy of the experience that I had, because in the community I was raised in, identification really mattered a lot. It was heavy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think partly for that reason, whenever anyone asks me to identify, I know it sounds like a dodge, but I feel really resistant to it.
Okay. Yes.
And I think it's partly because in most contexts, I feel like the labels can be misleading. So I guess, I mean, the things I think that I would feel more comfortable describing are what I do. And so, yeah, sometimes I find myself doing something that resembles prayer, but I'm not sure what it means when I do it. And it's definitely not directed towards a sort of divine sky being. I have no investment in that sort of supernatural theology, partly because I've come to believe that it's bad theology, at least on the terms of Christian thought.
But, I don't know if that's really a dodge. That's really an investigation. But on the one hand, you have been sort of tarred as an atheist already. You've literally gone through a heresy trial, but and I'm sure you've been marked by the community as that way, someone who's outside of it, who's not a Christian. And you've also it sounds like you've been inspired by the atheists, some atheist writing. So what then, when you think about what an atheist is, I guess that this is a good place to start. Do you have a working definition then of what it means to be an atheist, or what an atheist is?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing I'm interested in is paying attention to the things that people mean when they say it. So I think it's meant a lot of different things in different times and places. And one of the reasons I'm interested in atheism as a category is because I think it has real energy. Like there's a sort of force that it carries, which I think is important. I think it's something that people find helpful in trying to understand and bring sense to their lives, as a sort of disidentification with religion, or sort of distance from religion in some way. And I guess I feel like one of the things that interests me about it is noticing all the different things all the different ways that can look if someone is trying to distance themselves from religion, or has a sort of, it feels like to me there's a tense relationship that's at stake, because atheism sort of implies some relationship to some religious tradition. But given how diverse religion is in so many times and places, I feel like atheism can look a lot of ways. But I guess it's that. Sorry, I'm rambling my way to an answer. I guess it's that that sort of tension that seems like the main thing. And actually, let me say, I mean, one of the reasons I'm excited to talk to you guys is because I really love the work that you do in the podcast, and I've benefited from listening to it. Partly because I think you guys do this thing in a way that's really, really effective, really important, to sort of give people a chance to tell the story of their own form of atheism, humanism, non-religion. And I think one of the things that emerges for me as a listener to your podcast is just the sort of rich diversity of it. Yeah.
Yeah. I think another kind of aspect to the atheist label, in which you raise in your book, is this kind of, on the one hand, it's like, as an accusation that it's a label that's applied from other people to people who may not necessarily claim the label for themselves. And then it's also could be a positive self-identification. So there's that kind of tension there, perhaps. I don't know if you want to say more about that.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book is just how there's a shift that takes place in the early modern period, because for a long time, atheism was just an accusation. It was a way to suggest that someone is godless and immoral. But then in the early modern period, people start to claim it as a label, and then it sort of grows. It sort of unfurls in a way, and takes on a much richer and wider significance. And I mean, I'm sensitive about labels because of my own experience of having been labeled through this process that I was describing. But I'm also aware that for a lot of people, it can be really helpful as a way to sort of make sense for themselves of their lives. One of the thinkers who's probably influenced me, maybe it's a kind of spiritual guide in some way, is the philosopher Jacques Derrida, who is really, probably best known as the sort of father of postmodernism, one of the fathers of postmodernism. Deconstruction is his key idea. And he's really a pain in the ass to read. But the moments that I really like, Derrida speaks to me on a really deep level is when he's talking about growing up in a Jewish home in North Africa. And he was kicked out when he was a young boy, kicked out of school because the Vichy government was collaborating with Hitler, and the Jews were kicked out of school. The Vichy government was in control of North Africa at the time, in what's now Algeria. And he talks about how this really formed his suspicion of identification, because he saw that for the sort of political movement around Hitler and the sort of people who were collaborating with him, really strict distinctions became really important and were applied violently. And at the same time, in his Jewish community, he sort of recognizes that it remains formative for him. It's part of him. But he also is suspicious to some extent of the way in which, for the communities he was raised in, that sort of identification can also be sort of exclusivist and can close things down. And I feel like that's sort of where I'm at. Derrida says about himself that I pass for an atheist. So he's a certain sort of atheist. He's definitely not religious, but he's the sort of I don't know, the sort of thinker who wants to play in the sort of boundary, that sort of play in that point of tension between the atheism and religion. And I think that's where I'm at also.
Yeah, because we definitely see that history of it being used as sort of a slur, and this identification being imposed upon people, right? Like being marked as other. Even Socrates, despite the fact that he's talking about how he goes to the temples and the gods tell him that he's the wisest man, but he's put on trial as an atheist. And it's remarkable that this line, this sort of behavior, extends all across time, right up into, now, basically, right? With your own experience, and you go back even to people like Einstein in the 1930s. But atheism has seen this. I'm curious as to who those other atheist authors are. You're including Derrida in sort of atheism, this influence. And how much were the new atheists of the early 21st century, how much did they influence your thinking about this? Because they make very bold statements about what it is to be an atheist. The tension is more like conflict there, right?
No, you're right. Yeah, absolutely. I think the new atheism was really useful for me because I finished my bachelor's degree in 2003, and I feel like things were blowing up around that time. Dawkins and Hitchens and Dennett and Harris. I found it really helpful, formative, partly because I think they were sort of bringing it to the mainstream. One of the things I think you guys do a really good job of on the podcast is just showing how that intellectual movement was linked to various forms of activism that I think are also really important, sort of resisting the sort of theocratic tendency in American public life. I have a sort of funny perspective because I was raised in the U.S. I've lived in Australia for the last 9 years. I lived in the UK for 5 years before that, and so yeah, I'm struck by the fact that the U.S. is weird in a lot of ways. But in the U.S., there's this heavy sense that someone couldn't be a viable candidate for president, for instance, if they were honest about being atheists. We've probably had atheist presidents, but couldn't be honest about it. And I feel like the new atheists did a really good job of trying to sort of bring atheism into the public consciousness to show that that's a sort of richer and more compelling thing than the stereotype sometimes people have of it. But I feel like a lot of the authors that I've found helpful to think with have thought that it's important to take the next step beyond the new atheism. So insofar as, like you say, Tom, there's something They're like really attached to certain claims about the world, and in conflict with religious communities, sort of in general. And one of the things that I noticed once I came to study religion in an academic sense is that the criticisms that the New Atheists make apply really well to the sort of Christianity that I came from. But there are other forms of religious practice that don't really correspond to what the New Atheists say religion is. And once you realize that religion is more diverse, I think it's possible to see atheism as something that's not just defined by people like Dawkins and Dennett, but that there's a much wider range of ways to be atheist or non-religious.
Mm. Well, how would you define their sort of atheism? Like, what is it that, what is the sort of the pigeonhole that they're putting this really broad, multifaceted, various variety of atheism? How are they sort of doing it harm and by putting it in a little box? What is their little box like?
I mean, I think a lot of it is based upon the rejection of supernaturalism, and going with that a sort of a theory of the origin of the world. I mean, I was taught creationism, as I said. That was central to my upbringing as a kid, and I would go to these creationist rallies, about intelligent design. And it seems like a lot of what the New Atheist movement was trying to define atheism as was in opposition to that. So it's not the sort of anti-scientific, superstitious supernaturalist. When did you learn about evolution? I mean, I learned about it pretty early on, because what I learned is that the community I was raised in, kind of like the New Atheists were defining atheism in opposition to the people who raised me, they were defining their religion in opposition to people like the New Atheists. And so evolution was sort of in the conversation really early on for me, but as the sort of identified enemy, that sort of goes along with sort of godless Marxism and all the rest of it, the degeneracy of popular culture.
Right.
Was there a part of evolution that, like, when you first heard it, you're like, well, this makes sense? Or did it like, oh yeah, that's what happened? Or was it something that took forever to sort of counter program?
I mean, for me, I think one of the main moments was looking at the world a little more closely. I mean, I studied science when I was a kid, but it wasn't evolutionary science. It didn't come into it. But in my first year at college, I did a class on geology, which involved a lot of trips around the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia to look at rocks. And it seemed like believing that the world was old made a lot more sense of those rocks that I was seeing. It became more difficult to believe that it was 5,000 years old. Didn't seem to fit the rocks.
Yeah.
But one of the things I realized is that I think I was a difficult kid in a lot of ways. I was always, even when the only world I knew was this sort of fundamentalism, I was always sort of pushing and pulling and trying to find the cracks and fissures. And I think I had the feeling early on that the creation narrative, there were sort of holes in it, like, who, after Adam and Eve, how does the next generation of people reproduce? Yes. I mean, it gets weird if you think about it in much detail. Were dinosaurs and humans really cohabiting? How do they fit on the ark? That kind of thing. But one of the things I realized once I began my graduate studies in the academic study of religion is that a lot of Christians have had the same kind of questions. So Origen of Alexandria is maybe the first great Christian theologian in the 3rd, 4th century, who's really influenced by Greek philosophy. And he thought that God was the author of the Bible, but he thought God put things in the book of Genesis that couldn't be literally true. God put contradictions in the Bible in order to show people that you just can't read the whole thing literally, in order to encourage people to try to read it some other way. So I think I had a sense of that intuition early on.
That's clever.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Well, one thing kind of related to that is, I guess, like the formation of atheist identities I guess what I'm interested in is like whether, it's always kind of an oppositional identity, whether it's framed against whatever the dominant religious tradition is, or if there's a way to have a more positive or substantial atheist identity that doesn't always go back to like what it is rejecting. Rather, it's more of a positive thing.
Yeah. So you're asking about whether atheism can have a sort of positive identity without defining itself against a particular religious tradition. Yeah. I mean, I think it's something, I don't know. I feel like you guys have thought a lot more about this than I have. So I'd be interested to know what you think. But I mean, I feel like it's something that increasingly becomes a possibility, which is one of the reasons that the New Atheists were important. One of the reasons that your podcast is important, and other people that are working around atheism at the moment, is that if as atheism and non-religion is normalized, I think people can live it in a way that's maybe less anxious about its relationship to particular religious traditions. I mean, I listened to the interview that you guys did, episode before last, with the humanist chaplain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Shrishti,
yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was a great interview.
Great. Yeah,
it's a great interview. And one of the things I loved about what she was describing is just the way in which her work as a humanist chaplain isn't just about the beliefs that people have about the existence or not of a divine being, but that there's people's whole personalities at stake, and that humanism is something that can speak to that. It can speak to people in their ethical lives. It can speak to their concerns for justice. And also sometimes, as she described, it can have a kind of ritual dimension, because that's another thing that's important to people. And I feel like that's an important possibility that you're gesturing at.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I'm really glad you made that connection, because one of the things that Nathan and I had been discussing about that we'd read in your book was that you kind of find atheism as always embedded in this social context that includes a dominant religious tradition, right? It's not surprising that the New Atheists are really come out hard against the sort of fundamentalist Christianity that's at the time fighting textbooks for talking about evolution, right? Like, it is this reaction against something. But like, also related to that, we have, the sort of traditional view of atheism. We've got the two kind of hard definitions. It's someone who doesn't believe in God. It's the like dictionary definition. And you get the sociological one, which is where they're nuns, the NONES, where they don't believe, they don't behave as if they're Christians, they behave as if there is no God, and they don't belong to a church, right? And that's another sort of view. But the way you've discussed it, and what I really liked about it, just the organization of thought in your book, is that it's a much larger set of, I want to say variables, but that's not a good way to describe human interaction. It's part of its beliefs, part of its rituals, part of its behavior, part of its actions, part of it's what you're not. And what you just mentioned with Shrishti really, I think, kind of crystallizes this, is that, like, yeah, that's a position, something like a chaplain, which is a religious position in a secular institution that is now being deconverted or converted back to something secular. Do you see that a lot? If we take a bigger picture, take it outside of the US context, is this something you see with these varieties of of atheism?
Yeah, to see what exactly, Todd?
That it's this contextualization of atheism. It produces an alternative to this dominant social milieu.
Right. Yeah, I mean, my training is really in the history of religion and philosophy. I've read some about sort of sociology of contemporary atheism and non-religion. I found it really helpful. But one of the things that I was trying to do in this book on the varieties of atheism is to try to see what scholars of religion could contribute to this conversation. Because I think a lot of the time, a lot of the discussion around atheism is sort of driven forward by philosophy, I guess, as a discourse, or the empirical sciences. And one of the things that I like about the academic study of religion is that it has this kind of multifocal perspective that you're describing. It's kind of kaleidoscopic, because religious traditions, you can't just understand them as systems of belief, but they have this ritual dimension, there's art that they produce, there's ethical formation, there's the politics that they are formed by and are forming in response. And so just as religion is kaleidoscopic in this way, the main idea of the book is just to explore what would it look like to think about atheism in that perspective. And I think it proved in the book that resulted to be a helpful lens, partly because there are a lot of points where even the sort of classic atheists. So one of the things the book does is to try to revisit some of the classic atheists that are often anthologized by Hitchens and others as the sort of key drivers of atheism, like Friedrich Nietzsche or David Hume, to show the complexity of their atheism insofar as they were atheists. Like what kind is it? They're actually quite different. Nietzsche and Hume have different instincts, and they connect their atheism to politics in very different ways. They have a different relationship to the religious traditions that they're engaging with, and the sort of positive character of their non-religion or their sort of tense relationship with religion. Yeah, it has a different sort of texture to it. And so, yeah, I mean, I think in thinking about experience today, as I sort of listen to your podcast and read people talking about atheism these days, it seems like that kind of contextualization is really important. And it captures one of the things that scholars of religion have argued. People like Talal Asad or Charles Taylor have done influential work about secularization as an idea. So it's linked to this vision of atheism that rather than seeing secularization as just the disappearance of religion, leaving an empty space behind it as people disidentify, Taylor and Assad and many other scholars of religion argue that secularism has a kind of positive character, that it has a sort of vision of the world and human life and its meaning. And I think it's important to bring that perspective to the experiences that people are having of their atheism or non-religion today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think your book, I think one of the aims, I guess, I took away is that you want to try to find a way to create more dialogue, perhaps between atheists and theists. And maybe to put into a question, like, how do you think, what would be a good strategy maybe for doing that, like to have maybe not to see these two identities as like strict binaries or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that matters a lot to me, and it's, I think, an expression of the personal experience I described to you. I mean, I feel like the thing that really hurt me when I was a teenager, when I was going through this heresy trial, and I felt like none of these religious leaders, but including my father was among them, none of them seemed really interested to understand where I was coming from. There wasn't actually a desire to understand why I might think and live in the way that I do. And I found that really painful. I also found it just wasteful, because I feel like when I encounter another person, I feel like it's a chance to learn about how someone might think and do things differently than I do, and why they do it. And I felt like that kind of sort of obtuse foreclosure of curiosity, it seemed like I don't usually think in categories of sin, but I sort of feel like that's a sin. Like that's a violation of something really important about being human. People should do better than that. And so that's the reason why I think trying to find points of connection and conversation between particular atheists and particular religious communities can be really productive. Is, I think, the first thing, and you asked about how, I think the sort of first thing that's important is just to approach the conversation with a spirit of curiosity, to recognize that atheism isn't just one thing, religion isn't just one thing, but there's such a variety that it's important to pay attention to the person before you, or if you're reading a book, like, what is this person offering, and why are they understanding things in this way, in a way that it's a thing I've tried to model in my first book, which is the book on hope that you mentioned, which is about Jacques Derrida, the sort of atheist Jew, postmodern philosopher, and medieval theologian, Dionysius the Areopagite. And the thing that interests me about the conversation between them is that Dionysius is a theologian who says that Christians have to deny every claim that they make about God. There's this really deep negativity that he thinks is required. So in a certain sense, it is important to say for Christians, God does not exist. God does not have being, because being is a category that Dionysius thinks is inadequate to the divine. And Derrida, on the other hand, he's an atheist. He's not religious. He's not identified with the tradition, but he sort of reflects on how Judaism is formed, his instincts there. He talks sometimes about the prayer shawl and its continuing importance for him, and other sort of practices and ideas from Jewish thought, Christian thought. And I feel like they're sort of both pushing in the same direction in a way. And I feel like thinking at that intersection can be really productive.
One of the things, if we take this historical perspective, though, we go through the history, but it's also a dangerous road to go down, isn't it? I mean, that you can be labeled a heretic, that you can be excommunicated, you can be pushed aside. To focus on the positive, though, do we see this in history where actually there is this opportunity, something opens up, we have a conversation between these, forces of atheism, forces of religious tradition, and it leads to something new? It does create this bridge that we hope for. Have you in your studies found any historical example that we can look to and be like, all right, this is a pretty good one? Or is it all doom and gloom?
I mean, I think there are lots of moments where something exciting happens. I mean, the history that I'm familiar with is mostly intellectual history. So the question that you've asked me is not one that I'm really well equipped to answer very well. I mean,
even intellectually, that's an interesting aspect too.
I mean, a lot of my work is formed by 20th, 21st century French philosophy, and so Albert Camus is a thinker that has been really important for me. I mean, especially in pandemic times, it's been useful to go back to him, the author of The Plague. But Camus has this really sort of bleak honesty about the world, and there's this really powerful moral vision about Camus that you have to encounter the world honestly. People find lots of ways to distract themselves from the way things really are, and so his sort of existentialism is motivated partly by a desire to actually sort of face things as they are. And so for him, that means rejecting religion. He thinks that religion often, and religious hope in particular, often functions as this sort of distraction. It sort of makes people feel better. And so he wants to resist that. But I think for Camus, I mean, he still thinks really seriously about religious texts and traditions. And for the sort of French philosophers of the next generation, like Derrida, Michel Foucault in a different way, they're not religious. They're sort of informed by this desire to face the world honestly without religious illusions. But they recognize that thinking with religious texts and traditions can open up possibilities, especially for politics. For someone like Derrida, he's not religious, but he thinks that messianism as an idea, the idea that a Messiah will come, the sort of Jewish theology of the Messiah, that if we think about it in a really serious and rigorous way, it can teach us something about how democracy works, about how democracy should work, about how we should understand the politics that we have today. And so I feel like on that level, at least on the level of intellectual history, there are these people who are thinking at that sort of tense intersection between atheism and religion. And I think exciting stuff happens there. Yeah.
It's also interesting that everyone you cite is an atheist. It's all atheist thinkers who take religion seriously.
Oh, I mean, it's partly for your sake, Todd. I mean, I mean, one of the ways I found myself out of the fundamentalism I was raised with was reading Christian theologians who showed me that for the person I was then, that it's okay to think thoughts that have a kind of atheist shape. So I don't know, people like John Macquarie is not the best example, but Don Cupid or John Robinson. There are many others. I mean, John Caputo is someone I've learned a lot from. A lot of religious thinkers who think that to think seriously about religion, you have to think with atheists. And that was certainly my experience. Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, maybe I can just give you another sort of little vignette. One of the experiences that was really formative for me was When I was living in England, which is a very secular society, I was doing my graduate studies. I was part of a theological discussion group at my local Anglican church because, like I was at that point still feeling pretty unsettled. I wanted people to talk to. And what that group was essentially were people who understood themselves as being Anglican Christians, but also some who understood themselves as being atheists in some way, thinking together about the problems that they were worried about. And I feel like that was one of the experiences that showed me this. It was a small group of people, it was only maybe 6 or 7 people, 8 at the most. But the most important thing about it, I think, is that questions were welcome there in a way that they certainly weren't in the church that I was raised in. But I also felt like they weren't in some of the new atheist communities that I was learning about around the same time. And things were understood to be a bit more ambiguous to the extent that we had to sort of think through them together. And that was quite healing for me to realize that was a possibility for my 22-year-old self.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think it's an interesting point that, this question of belief in God, it may not be the best way to kind of draw boundaries between people, or you may not get the most meaningful divisions if you do draw the boundaries in that way. One thing, just sort of a tangent that I was thinking about, I wondered what you thought about like interfaith meetings or whatever. I've never been a part of it, so I don't really know. But one kind of criticism I've heard is that even if they include, a humanist or atheist perspective, that in a way it does kind of, rather than opening things up, it maybe even kind of like silos people into like, here's the Christian perspective, here's the Muslim perspective, or the humanist perspective, and it kind of removes that kind of nuance or ambiguity or complexity or whatever. I don't know. It's just kind of a tangent thought that I had. I wonder if you have any thoughts about interfaith dialogues.
I have strong feelings about that.
Oh, you did? Okay, great.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think you're right that. So because I'm in the academic study of religion and I have sort of broad ecumenical interests, like I'm interested in finding connections across difference in a lot of different ways. I've sort of found myself in interfaith settings at various points. In those contexts, I'm often the one making the argument that this isn't broad enough if it doesn't include atheism, humanism, non-religion. But one of the problems, as you say, Nathan, is that the space is often set up in a way that, let's say, it discourages nuanced identification and reflection. Because, you sort of take a topic and then ask, what's the Christian view? Well, what's the Jewish view? And you can add humanism to that, but it still just becomes, I don't know, a sort of a list rather than something that explores the questions that are genuinely ambiguous. The sort of the fact that there's often debate within traditions about even issues like abortion. That's one of the things that Srishti talked about was importance of her advocacy around that. But within Christianity, you wouldn't know it from American public discourse, but there's a wide range of positions on things like abortion or sexuality and all the rest of it. I think one of the issues is often with the term faith. This is another thing that Srishti said that I found really helpful. Is she said that the word faith she thinks is narrowing. I think it doesn't have to work like that. Like it's possible to think about faith as something that's broader than dogmatic belief, but it often works that way as a category. And I think in interfaith quote unquote contexts, often what's happening is people are taken to represent a certain faith, which is often understood as holding certain beliefs, like a list of them. And I'm more interested, I guess, in opening up spaces for conversation that don't make those sorts of presumptions and assumptions about where people are coming from, but where the questions are more open.
The last thing we can get to before moving on to kind of True Atheist is how we can use atheism to sort of understand religious power today. Does it, to what extent does it allow that for us to interrogate how religion has some form of power socially?
Yeah, I'm interested to know what you think about that, Todd. I think just really briefly, I can say, I think the sort of advocacy around secularism is really important. because I think often religious freedom is held up as an idea when in fact it is cover for privileging a certain religious perspective.
It absolutely is these days, right? It's just used to assert and reassert a particular privilege, right? Which I like. One of the things and this is again, it's something I think it comes up in your book, and it helped me sort of formalize my thinking a little bit more, was that the way I think about what religion ought to be, right? When they fight for rights, it should be part of a struggle. It should be part of suffering, right? I don't know why I didn't really understand why my mind went there. But the idea is like, if you want to be a religious person in a secular society, it should be difficult. It should be a challenge. It shouldn't be done for you, right? It should be something that's you impose upon yourself as part of a discipline, right? We think about things like Ramadan. Ramadan is not easy. That's the point, right? But in the U.S., what we're typically seeing is like this idea of religious rights means I get to do whatever I want, whenever I want, to anybody I want, and that's that. But my perspective on what the religion is not shaped by every religion, by ideas of religion. It probably comes from a little bit from Catholicism, which is like I was raised Catholic. You got to suffer. You're guilty. You've got to find ways the world is a horrible place. You've got to go out there, find a way to make it better, live in this world that's tough, and be selfless about it. Well, all these things. This is a whole nest of things. But what I realize I'm doing is I'm also projecting my view of religion onto it. One of the things you wrote about, it's like, yeah, look, of course, when you look at religion, you look at atheism in America today, it's a reaction to this sort of mainline Protestantism, or it's perhaps against Catholic activism, which we kind of see around, actually, we definitely see around the anti-abortion efforts. So, of course, that's how I see it, but that's not how religion sees it. And that's something that it's a tough bridge, as you were talking about before, like it's tough without there being that discourse across the aisle. So that the idea of atheism being a response in a particular context is incredibly helpful, I think, for me understanding how I think about religion.
That really resonates with me, Todd. Yeah. I mean, one of the things I'm remembering hearing you talk about that is reading in my first year of college, Soren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher. He's a Christian thinker, but his point was, much as you're describing, that it should be hard. Faith should be sort of heroic. It shouldn't just be the obvious thing. If it is, it's not real faith, he suggests.
Yeah. I mean, that's the idea of the leap of faith, right? Is that, exactly, it's impossible. When God tells you to kill your son, you're doing something terrible. And you just have to have faith that there's something on the other side of it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I mean, one of the essays in this book, The Varieties of Atheism, is about Nietzsche, and argues that for Nietzsche, atheism is similar, that atheism shouldn't be too easy. Nietzsche is dismissive of atheists who sort of disbelieve in God, but everything else in their world remains the same. For Nietzsche, atheism ought to be transformative. It ought to have implications for how people live, for their imagination, for the rest of it. And that's not an easy thing to do, partly because all of us are formed by cultural contexts. But yeah, I mean, I think in the context of American public life in particular, but there's a version of it in Australia, I think atheism and secularism has a hugely important role to play in public conversations around these issues.
David, real quick, was there a transformation for you? Was it transformative?
Was what transformative?
Moving at this move to atheism, or at least move away from religion. How did it transform you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something. I feel like I'm still trying to do the thing that I was forced to do when I was 18 and kicked out of this church, which is trying to figure out how to live with integrity in the world in a way that's honest. And I feel like I experienced a series of transformations. I mean, early on, it was about sort of recognizing that a Buddhist can be, a good and loving person. I had transformations about sexuality. You know, like I was raised with a lot of anxiety around gay people, and that was an important thing that was opened up by the shifts that were taking place for me. But I think one of the things that the place where I'm at now in this ongoing transformation is about right-wing politics. I've been thinking a lot about right-wing populism and the damage that it does to especially American society, but America has unfortunately been quite good at exporting this sort of right-wing politics to other parts of the world. And often that's religiously motivated or at least religiously justified, I think is the better way to put it. And I think the place that I'm at now politically is informed by the atheists that I continue to read in seeing just how damaging and destructive that form of politics is.
Well, on that note, that's a happy one.
I mean, maybe it's best just to say, like, this is where the fight is. So I think the things you're talking about, Todd, the rubber meets the road, because these questions around atheism and non-religion are not just abstract questions of belief, but they have effects for what freedoms are people going to have in American society. To what extent is non-religious liberty going to be preserved? That will have a big impact, especially on the lives of trans people and women and racial minorities. It's an important fight to have, I think. Yeah, but the fight is the focus, I think, not the sort of gloom. It's gloomy, but we can fight.
Yeah. That's a good point. That we should refocus on that. Yes. Okay. And in that sense, it is the fight, right? It's not the situation. It's not the slippery slope. It's how we respond to it. And with that in mind, let's think about other things a true atheist can do. I'm sure you're aware of the logical fallacy of the true Scotsman. Today, we're going to instead talk about a true atheist. These are yes and no questions. You can add clarification. So if the first one is, let's start with a simple one. David Newheiser, can a true atheist believe in God?
Oh, man.
Not a trick question, by the way.
I mean, I feel like this is gonna be might sound a bit vague. I mean, I think when people talk about what they believe, often that's expressing something that they feel. I think belief isn't just intellectual, but it implicates, it's often motivated by emotion, when people's relationship to other people. And in that sense, I think an atheist can believe in God in the sense that they feel sort of pulled in a certain direction. I think the atheist I'm drawn to can be promiscuous in that way.
Ooh.
All right. Great. Okay. And on a similar note, can a true atheist be religious?
Oh, that's a harder one, I feel like. I mean, I do really have promiscuous instincts when it comes to atheism. So I'm going to say yes, a true atheist can be religious.
What would a religious atheist look like? What would that be?
I mean, I think someone who sometimes goes to temple without being sure why they're doing it. Someone who values Shabbat as a practice, for instance, or like Derrida in his prayer shawl. I mean, one of the things about religion is that it's often because Protestant Christianity has had such an impact on the sort of early construction of the category of religion. It's often defined in terms of belief. For Catholics, like you were saying, Todd, or for Muslims and Jews and many other Hindus, the things people do are more central to it. And in that sense, I think people can hold dual identities in more than one way. Maybe one of them is to be atheist and religious in that sense.
Well, let's push it a little further then. Can a true atheist wish for a world without religion?
I mean, I think it's an empirical question. Atheists do wish for a world without religion.
Yeah. Have you ever found yourself? Have you ever wished like that you weren't raised religiously at all?
I mean, I do. It's funny. just hearing you ask that question, it evokes complex emotions in me, because the story that I told you is still wounding in some ways, and it colors. You know, I have a close relationship with my parents, but it's exhausting, and it's colored.
Sorry to laugh, but
no. I mean,
but I get it. Yeah, I mean, at least you have a relationship, though. That's considering the ordeal, literally the ordeal. That's amazing that you still come out of that with one.
I mean, honestly, you mentioned at the beginning that I'm writing a book on miracles at the moment. That's the one time I feel like I have felt something like a miracle happen in my life, when we figured out how to maintain a relationship. So I feel like even though it's a wound, I feel like it's also a gift in a certain sense. And one of the reasons that I'm interested in atheism as a category, maybe I feel like it's more vivid than a category like none, for instance, N-O-N-E, none, is that it seems to suggest that something matters, something's at stake in religion. And I feel like that's one of the things that I learned from my upbringing, is that religion can be ugly, it can be beautiful, it can be brilliant, it can be very stupid, but there's something that happens when people get together and they engage in these practices and they form communities in this way that's really interesting and really important to take seriously. And so in that sense, I don't know, I feel like a true atheist can wish for a world without religion, but they shouldn't, because I think that would be a less interesting world.
Yes, that's right.
Fantastic. Yeah.
All right. For one that doesn't really have anything to do with the preceding questions, can a true atheist eat animals?
Oh, yeah. I feel like on a personal level, I'm pretty sure I should eat fewer animals than I do. But I think, I mean, one of the implications of my view that atheism is complex and promiscuous and really varied is that I don't think there's one ethical view. I don't think it can be arranged dogmatically in that way. So, you know, like I've read Peter Singer. He's why I worry that I shouldn't eat animals anymore. But I do sometimes eat animals with a bad conscience. And I think, I don't know, moral life is really complex.
It is. And this is an interesting one. And it's almost like this one, the eating animals question, is almost more, I don't want to say rigid, but we get more similar answers to that than we do with can a true atheist believe in God, oddly enough. Yeah. It's a weird thing, that it's a weird correlation, and we haven't figured it out yet. But it's got to be in there, because it's like we just need to know. It may come down to, one of the things I've noticed is, like, telling people you're vegan is about the same as telling them you're an atheist. It's pretty much equivalent. People are going to fight you on it, and they're going to try to make you eat food, try to make you eat meat. And it's yeah, and I know we can develop a lot of pet theories about it, but that immediate resistance, like when you tell someone I don't eat meat, that pushback you get feels very similar to it. And one of the things you discussed in the book was like this, you know, in addition to like being ethical, being scientifically minded, being, you know, like resistant and defiant. I think it's defiance is in there. Like all of these, it seems to be adding up to that. And this is one I want to put in the defiance category. I've gone on too long. You had a great answer. That was an aside. It can get cut out.
Defiance. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's a piece there. Can a true atheist reject philosophy and believe in nothing? We hear it a lot, that atheists believe in nothing.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't not think of The Big Lebowski when you say that.
They're nihilists, dude.
We are nihilists. We believe in nothing. I mean, I think I imagine what people might mean when they say that is that they don't subscribe to a system of dogma. And that's definitely something that people can do. I mean, as I've suggested, I think it's something that religious people should try to do. And atheists can probably teach them a lot about how to do that. But I'm drawn to philosophy, I think mainly because it's just, I don't know, Socrates, that famous atheist, said the unexamined life is not worth living. It's just about trying to think about what your life means, what's going on in your world. And someone like Socrates, it's about the questions more than the answers. And in that sense, I think a person really, can a person live without questions? I'd like to meet that person. It'd be interesting. I think people have questions most of the time.
Yeah. All right. And for the last question, can a true atheist have hope for the future?
Oh, beautiful. Yeah, I think so. And that's, my first book is about hope. In part because I think atheists can teach religious people a lot about hope, because hope is often made out to be in religious traditions a kind of certainty, like everything's going to be okay in the end. You have this certain hope. But I think even for religious people, this is something that atheist thinkers like Camus bring out. Even for religious people, hope has a kind of fragility to it. It's vulnerable to disappointment. The future is uncertain as a question of fact. And that makes hope into a kind of bold act. I mean, I think defiance can be part of it, as Todd was just talking about. There's a kind of, Camus calls it revolt, kind of rebellion against things as they are, the desire that things would be different, that things would be better. And I think that holding on to that desire, even though it's vulnerable to disappointment, that's just what I think hope is. That's my definition of hope, is holding on to a desire, even though it's uncertain. And I think that's really important. I think it's really important for imagining a world that's more just and more beautiful and better than it is. So yeah, an atheist can hope for the better future, which certainly doesn't mean being confident that the future is going to be better, because I think we probably have good reason to think that it's going to be worse. I mean, the heat wave over the last few weeks is just terrifying, not to mention the politics and everything else about human society. I think, but I think the kind of hope that's worth having incorporates this kind of pessimism within it. It's honest about how things actually are hard, but that sort of holds on defiantly to the desire for something better.
Yeah. That's a great answer. Yeah.
And a beautiful place to end it. David, thank you so much for joining us today. Do you have anything you want to plug? Anyone you want to give a shout out to?
Oh man,
where people can find your upcoming work?
So many people. I want to thank my parents for all that they've given me. That's not entirely a joke, but yeah, I mean, you mentioned the book. I think some of your listeners will find the Varieties of Atheism interesting. It's a collection, so I wrote the introduction, which we've talked around a little bit. But it's also, there's just a really diverse group of scholars who are reflecting on how atheism is more than one thing in relation to science and ethics and politics and life and love and all the rest of it. I'm really excited that book is out, and the contributors are some of my favorite people. So I'm just really happy about that. I am on the internet, so you can find me. I'm on Twitter and now Threads, although I haven't figured out Threads yet, but I'm there. So yeah, I would love to connect with people.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll include the links down below for all that. Well, thanks so much, David. It was really great to talk with you.
Such a pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, that was David Newheiser. It was really interesting talking with him about his new book. So Todd, what were some of your takeaways from that?
Well, I mean, the first thing we can't overlook is what an incredible story. That's just, have it being put on, church trial for heresy.
Yes. Yeah.
Effectively by your family.
Yeah.
Is nuts. That's a crazy, crazy thing to do to someone. That's really awful.
Yeah.
Basically for being nice. That's the weird thing.
Yes. Yeah. I think we find that so many times, that people's morality is just better than the church or the whatever religious institution they're involved in, and that's what leads them out of it.
And he said that as much, right? He's trying to live the principles that he thought he was raised with.
Right. Yes. Yes.
But it's also related to that though, and it's one of the things that he brings up in the introduction to the book, which is a wonderful collection, by the way. It's great. It's like you can choose your own adventure wherever you're interested in reading about, and it's deep. But he goes through a very short genealogy, right? Like the history, it's the family tree of atheism. And one of the things he points out is like, it's a lot of othering, right? Kind of what happened to him. For a long time, this idea of an atheist is this person who doesn't belong with us, right? They have these crazy, wacky ideas. They're out. And what he points to is that it's never just one dimension, right? It comes with this whole set of other beliefs that develop out of the context, the historical context. And as it unfolds over time, things start to change to the point where we're at now, which is where people are taking on the idea of the identity. They're taking on the identity of an atheist, right? What does it mean to be an atheist? Saying, this is what I am. And with it, it's not just one thing. It's not just this belief in God. It comes with both, the sort of classical sets of what we see as a religious person, right? There's not the belonging, there's not the belief, there's not the behavior, but there's also a positive expression. We see it's connected to ideas of ethics, right? How do we live our lives in the absence of a God? People choose this for themselves. What's your relationship with authority? When is it appropriate? When is it not appropriate? How reason and experience in the material world informs your life? What's the how much of science should we believe? When does science become moral? These are big questions that we have to ask. So it points the way, I think. One of the things I found it does is it points the way to a positive belief in the context of a single sort of dominant social expression of religion, which is why you're going to get these varieties of it. So I think for me, it sort of gave shape to a way to think about sort of what the big A atheists are, what nuns can sort of be, and how this whole set, these dimensions, these expressions of atheism, it doesn't fill in the blank, but it shows what the categories are. It shows what the blanks are, I guess. That's one of the big takeaways for me. And he definitely added to that through this discussion. It really clarified a lot. Nathan, what about you? Was there a big takeaway?
Yeah, I think in addition to what you said, one thing I was thinking about more from the interview in the book was just that when we divide people up into atheist and theist, I do think it can be valuable to divide people in that way, or to use that as a dividing line. But I also think that there are cases where an atheist might have more in common with some like progressive Christian or a Unitarian or something like that than a progressive Christian or Unitarian has with a really conservative evangelical Christian or something. Even though, they could still be lumped under the category of theist, I think the one group is maybe closer actually, or shares more in common with atheists in terms of even though they may disagree on the God question, they might be closer on other issues of ethics, also like even epistemology, maybe things like that.
Yeah.
And so I think that's an important point sometimes to not to be, divide the line or whatever, draw the line too sharply, because I think we touched on, maybe, I don't know if it was in the bonus segment or not, but just this, when it comes to like mobilizing.
Don't give it away for free, Nathan, if you did.
When it comes to like mobilizing politically, I mean, obviously, like, there's a lot in common that atheists might share with more progressive religious people. And I don't think it makes sense to work together with them. Yeah.
Do you think that it's currently a big issue and I mean, personally too, like for you to work with someone or be friendly with someone who is religious or theistic?
No, exactly. I think it would be one thing we may disagree about, but there's potentially many things we would agree on. And then I think another point too is like, there are some atheists who we wouldn't want to work with or be friends with, even though we agree on the God question. So I think that's, I don't know. I'm not sure. I wonder if, I think most atheists are probably open to it. I mean, I don't think it's like anything, groundbreaking that I'm talking about. I don't know. What do you think?
Right. Well, I mean, I'm still wary to come out of the closet a lot of times, quite often, around
I
religious
see.
people. That's the thing, because I don't think, and I'm sure this is a bit of projection. I don't know how much of this is projection, like how it would affect a relationship I had with someone who is religious and we agreed on everything and we were trying to achieve a political goal, how much it would matter to them that I was an atheist.
Yeah, that's true. I guess it depends, like in so many things, like the context and like the kind of relationship and whatever that you have with the person. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah, well, do you think
Right?
like would there be more hesitation, you think, from the religious side to work with atheists or from the atheist side to work with religious people?
Oh yes.
The first?
For religious
Uh-huh.
people to work with atheists.
Okay.
And we've spoken to a lot of people, primarily in the South, who are still deeply concerned about coming out. And it means their livelihood, quite often jobs, family, they're all social networks. And that to me is the risk, that I see it kind of one-sided. I do think the thing that I think is, I completely agree with you on it. Yeah, we can't lose sight of that, right? And I think most of us have that kind of view now, where it's like, look, you believe what you want. I don't share that belief, but you're free to believe it, and it's fine. And that it's something that I hope, generations from now, when atheists or like secularists or nuns have become a majority, that we don't lose sight of. That like it's not a threat to our atheism for people who hold particular beliefs about a personal God. And I think it's possible to make that world, right? Like I think our idea, which is essentially, right, like secular idea, right? Like you can hold these multitudes of beliefs, you can all work together. You have to tolerate this difference. It's classical liberalism, and function together as a cohesive society. You can do it, and you have to do it. But this is not necessarily the religious view, right?
Yes.
That's where the threat's coming from, right? Like we hold this view of like, okay, religion is this idea of a personal God, and this is part of the context that this is what we're seeing in America now, right? Some people hold a view it's a personal God, other people believe it's not. We need to impose this the will of our God on larger society, and that's a problem, right? Like you can't tolerate someone who says everyone needs to believe this, everyone needs to act this way as if they believe. And that's when it becomes intolerable. You can't tolerate it.
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. Yeah. When people are trying to impose it on someone else, through whatever coercion or through the state or something like that. Yeah. Yes. But I think but in that case, again, there would be religious people who also have an interest in preserving secularism, because they don't want to be imposed upon either.
Yeah. Well, there's a baker in Colorado who disagrees with you, but yes, it's definitely a value. I think it's a value that atheists hold and need to expound upon and build. All right. This is, you know what, maybe we've just filled in that blank, Nathan, right? It's a bit tolerance.
Yes.
A little bit, right?
Yes.
Tolerate people who are tolerant. Don't tolerate the intolerant, and always be tolerant. Although I think there's a paradox in there, but someone else can figure that out.
Yeah,
That's not
I'm
what
sure
we're here to
someone's
do today.
addressed that. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I'm sure it's been solved. It's on a paper somewhere, probably in a journal. Yeah.
Anyway.
But I feel good about it. I do feel talking to David. He's got a great voice.
Yes.
He does so much great.
The perfect podcast voice.
Yeah. And can talk, right? Everything's right.
Yeah.
And it's having this kind of conversation, right? It's illuminating, isn't it?
It was really great talking with him. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Between his history and the work that he's doing, which is fascinating. I hope to talk to him again about miracles and hope and all sorts of stuff.
Yes.
Really interesting stuff. Otherwise, it's hot, and we're getting some of your terrible Canadian air down here. So I'm housebound again, which is great because I'm pretty much a hermit. What have you been up to, Nathan? Do you have anything coming up that's important that you want to share with the world?
Nothing to plug. Nope. But yeah, we'll include links for David's stuff, all that he's been up to. Yes.
Yeah, links below. Check it out.
Yeah.
If you have questions or feedback, we love hearing from you. If you have complaints, we especially love hearing from you. That's at Nath G. Alexander on Twitter. Are you on Threads yet, Nathan?
No, I don't know if I'll go on it. But, yeah, it seems too complicated. I don't know. Yeah,
using a different app. It's a pain.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So hit us up anytime. Otherwise, man, big thank you to David. Big thank you to you guys for listening, especially our patrons. The link for the patron is down below. If you don't have money, if things are tight, hey, click like and subscribe. Just as good, and you never miss an episode. We're gonna be coming at you again soon. All right. Bye-bye.